Good. Thank you for the invitation to talk here in this very interesting session, and we've heard a lot of exciting stuff. My title may seem a bit strange. I will explain what I mean by that after I've introduced a little bit about the organization that I represent here, EMBO. And basically, I will be representing the scientists, and the general theme will be that our community equals innovation, and we need to listen to the scientific community, observe them to learn what is needed in terms of guidance for them in terms of responsible conduct in research. So, does this work? Yes. So EMBO stands for European Molecular Biology Organization, was founded in 1964 with the aim of supporting this new science at the time and fostering cross-border interactions of young researchers in Europe. Our communities are varied, but they're all life scientists. So the most important are probably our members. There are about 1,500 now in Europe, plus about 300 worldwide. They're elected annually through peer review, and they really are the leading life scientists across the entire range of the life sciences. We also have postdoctoral fellows. We elect about 200 a year, and young investigator, a very highly selective program of the 20 top leading young people who've just become independent and started their labs in Europe. And it's these communities to whom we really listen, that inform us, that determine our policies, and that support all of our programs. What we do is we fund courses and workshops, about 80, 90, 100 per year. We run a policy program, and we actually publish 5 journals. And it is in those programs that we ourselves are very innovative. So, for instance, in the fellowship program, we were the first to introduce pensions for fellows, to introduce childcare, parental leave, etc., things that now seem normal but weren't at the time. In our publications, we really push what we call the transparent process. It was EMBO who introduced the publication of referees' reports, cross-commenting among referees, all policies that have now become standard, or at least have become gold standard in many journals. So we're very flexible and really care about innovating in the interest of science. We have, and I want to say I'm absolutely in favor, and we have in fact been pushing this, what did he call it, publication processes quality assessment that Alan Finkel was pushing last night. I think that would be fantastic, especially in the time of Plan S, which gives predatory publishers such huge options. We really need this kind of assessment. So we're all gung-ho on that. Really, as EMBO, we have features of many kinds of organizations. I said we're like an academy with our membership. We're like a funder with our courses and workshops and our fellowships. And there we can actually push for things like responsible conduct and research. And like I said, we ourselves are innovative. So back to policy. We've done a lot of policy in the area that is of interest to this meeting. Recently, there was a workshop on the interactions between universities and journal editors. Many of the participants are also here, one sadly missing, Paul Taylor. We've had a very interesting workshop on the limits of peer review and on focal randomization. This year, very recently, we had a workshop on the need for a central clearinghouse or an agency that sets a coordinated framework for research misconduct investigations in Europe. Many institutions have no office at all that does this, and many countries have no laws. It's quite amazing. And even more recently, at the bottom here, we've participated in a workshop on new indicators for journals, and our head of publications, Bernd Pulverer, is one of the co-authors on that. And we mandate responsible, the science policy program is in charge of responsible conduct and research, and they do training on this. They go to institutions in our member states to talk to administrators and scientists themselves about what's available. And finally, EMBO was not just a signatory, but a co-funder of DORA. EMBO Science Policy Office has staff who is permanently working on DORA, and we really promulgate the principles of DORA at EMBO. So our applicants are banned from listing impact factors, H indices, or any other metrics if they can't read the instructions, and it's amazing how many scientists can't read instructions. Our offices go and cross them out. And the committees are not allowed to use those metrics. I mention these things because in the end, the only way things will change is if funders and organizations insist on change. So for instance, for our advanced fellows, we don't even look at their publication lists. They're supposed to put in a 1.5-page summary of what they have done that's been innovative and interesting, original, and what they intend to do in the next 2 or 3 years. And that's the only thing that's paid attention to. Journals aren't looked at all. And we do the same for the winner of our gold medal. This is one scientist under 40 selected each year for a gold medal. Again, the committee, which is our council that looks at this, is told by editors about the achievements. Journals aren't mentioned. So it is possible, and I happen to believe we're doing a good job at this. Okay, so now for my title and for the topic of this meeting. I said I represent the researchers, and we've heard a lot from institutions and from organizations about the researchers, but I think the researchers are really what matters, and they have to be on board. And I think one thing that seems to get forgotten is that researchers are actually there because they love to do research. These are not glamour jobs. For very few they become glamour jobs. For most of them, they're trudge most of the time, but they love research, and that's why they do it. And one example, and they would all like to be the ones who make the breakthrough discoveries. And one who is often mentioned is Andre Geim with his Friday night experiment, who's also famously said, better to be wrong than boring. That's all very fine. And of course, he has done fantastic things in his Friday night experiments. But most of us aren't Andre Geim, and are not quite that caliber. The other thing I should say, he's done these experiments sort of off the record. Some of them were highly unethical. Pouring water down a high field magnet that you've cranked up to maximum, just pouring water down the middle. It's pretty crazy. And taking a frog and sticking it down there, even more. I bet he didn't have a permit. Anyway, those are the scientists that the people who want to drive innovation want to see. And that's what most of us want to be like. So this, of course, leads to innovation, but I'm not even sure what innovation means. And so for the purposes of my talk, I'll just talk about research and assume that ideally research leads to innovation, but we can't know, and we're not all Andre Geim. Okay, so what I want to say, what my title is trying to say is sort of, I'm trying to get across here. So what we've been looking at is do researchers do what integrity rules demand? We have our rules, and what can we do to make researchers abide by them? Do they do what the law says, and do they do what the funders require? How about turning this around and asking, do our research integrity approaches actually serve the needs of researchers to do things right? Are our laws up to date? They often aren't, because science changes so fast, and have the funders kept up? And in order to find that out, I think a good idea is to ask the researchers. And so I'll give you a little bit of feedback that we have. So as I mentioned, we have introduced for all of the researchers we fund mandatory research training. And they have to take, if they don't have other ways of proving that they've taken extensive training, they have to take the Epigeum course. We see the stand of Epigeum outside. It was developed in the context of this conference, actually, and we've contributed and are still contributing big time. So our researchers have to take this course, and we often get interesting feedback. For instance, here is one from a young man who really cares. And he said, although I've been doing research for more than 15 years, I was not aware of many important details. I'm ashamed in admitting that I've sometimes followed and witnessed incorrect research conduct without even noticing. Of course, I haven't done anything evil, but in the future I will pay more attention. I think that more education at all levels is needed to get the research community aware and more attentive to research integrity. We went back and asked him, well, what was it really? And I'll keep this anonymous. One was the honorary authorships that you do as a favor to colleagues. Some people find that is really the only way to stay afloat in the competition. And don't realize that this is unethical. Submission to same results to multiple journals. I've actually had that in my own lab, a postdoc who said, well, why can't we just ask both journals at the same time to which it fits? And really, if you think about it, there is no reason why that is bad a priori. It's just become the standard that you don't do that, and the journals demand that you don't do it. So people have to learn that. It is not a priori understandable why that should be so. When you have a product, you can go around and put it on the market, and anybody can have a look at it. So doing the right thing is not always clear, and we need to help researchers. And so those are some of the limits in dealing with research and integrity. There's a lack of knowledge. There's also a lack of interest. Of course, many scientists don't want to do that. They really mope if they hear that they have to do a 6-hour. They think that's a huge imposement that they should spend 6 hours doing such a course. But that lack of interest is not only on the side of researchers, it's also the administrators. And it's sometimes quite shocking. And so what's happened, in fact, and again, we see this in our organization, is that the journals have become the police. We now have a dedicated person who checks the data that come in for integrity before publication. And you wouldn't believe how many incidences of not misconduct, but of probably often serious error we find. In fact, our current expert is here, and our previous expert is also here. She's become independent. They've got a lot of work on their hands. And when the journals become the police and go back to the institutions, they're often met with very little interest on the side of the institutions to pursue problem cases. So that has to change. It's not just the researchers, it's also the administrations. And then, perhaps more importantly, I think many of the guidance on responsible conduct in research and research integrity doesn't always address the underlying issues. For me, they are extreme competition. Now, competition is good. We're all competitive, whether it's who's fastest at doing the Sunday Times crossword puzzle or the killer Sudoku or building the highest Lego tower. Even children are. We're all competitive, and science clearly is competitive. We want to be first at finding out that new thing. That's good competition. Competition for funds is almost part of that. We've got to propose the best, make the best proposal. We want to compete in convincing the funders. But when competition comes to jobs and is at the level that we're witnessing now, it becomes lethal, and then it becomes very hard not to tweak that figure. And of course, this is exacerbated by inappropriate awards. When countries or administrations begin to promise researchers extra income for funding in the high impact journal, and the journal wants that figure, it is very hard not to find the data that will lead to that figure. So I think these are two areas where the researchers are completely helpless and need help, and are not the perpetrators, but the administrators and the universities and the institutions are. So researchers are therefore often more conservative than they would need to be. They look at conservative research strategies that are clearly going to lead to outcomes. They can't take risks. Increased risk-taking and the publication of experimental failures would improve the speed of discovery, but there's no freedom and no rewards for the scientists. And this would require institutional shifts and grant-making evaluation, and it's nice to have heard from Maura thoughts on that. We again went back to our own communities and asked, but funders, administrators, and publishers are conservative too. I've just made that point. So we've again gone back to our own community and asked in this time our most selected community, which are actually not our members, but our younger most selected, our young investigators. These are the ones who are expected to make breakthrough discoveries or who have just made them. And we included in the survey also our gold medal winners, who are the ones who really are the stars. And we asked, what were the main contributing factors to the discoveries that you have made? And we got a huge amount of feedback, and I'll just list the sort of top lines. Funding. They feel that stable and longer-term funds are important. They're happy to compete. They're happy to have their grants rejected. Well, they're not happy, but they understand that that's part of the game. But they feel that stable and flexible is important. So one Israeli very successful researcher wrote back to us and says she spends most of her time writing and reading grants. If you get 70,000 for a 2-year period, by the time you've got that money, you're already having to ask for the next one and write up your final report. So that is really no good. Stable, long-term, and flexibility. And the flexibility also translates to freedom. If you write a grant for 5 years, you have to think way ahead. Things change. These young researchers want the flexibility to make ad hoc decisions and suddenly do something completely new because they've had a new idea. We don't have grants for that. You can't write grants so fast as you have new ideas. And they really cherish an intellectual environment, a very critical and stimulating colleagues, and a good scientific culture. And of course, the high-level core facilities are important. So I think we should take this into consideration when we think about what researchers need in terms of doing good, proper research at a high level of integrity, and take that into account when we make the rules. And that's where I want to stop. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Leptin, for also bringing the realistic perspective from researchers, even in facing challenges in promoting research integrity. And this is partly why Dr. Paul Taylor was so visionary, because he knew there would be these challenges, as Dr. Day and Dr. Heine raised, in integrating and incorporating the concepts related to responsible innovation and impact. So there must be questions from the audience.
Thank you very much. I really liked what you said about that we turn it around and think about what our researchers need instead of saying that they have to, that we try to check whether they stick to the role. What I didn't agree fully was what you said about the pressure leading to, let's say, more competition, leading to more breaches possibly. I think it plays a role, but if I look at, let's say, our most famous example in the Netherlands, this in this breach of research integrity, it had already begun a long time before the pressure was on with this particular person. So in my university, one of my deans asked me, like, okay, but how do I find those researchers that actually do not want to do the right thing? Could you comment on that?
How do I find researchers that do not want to do the right thing? Well, it's very strange. I find it odd that, I think by creating a culture, because no researcher works on their own. They work in groups. They have graduate students and postdoctoral fellows. They may be graduate students and postdoctoral fellows. For that group not to notice at all that something is amiss is strange. And in fact, we know that they notice. We know that there are young people who are uncomfortable with what is being demanded by their PI, colleagues being uncomfortable with what they hear in group meetings. A very, very clever cheat is hard to detect, but I think they're rare. It's often sort of half half acceptable methods. The thing is that institutions need rules for whistleblowers. I think there's a session on that this afternoon. And people need to be trained to say it's okay to go and talk to somebody. There has to be somebody to talk to. It's very hard for dependents to rat on their supervisor. But to create that, it's important to create a culture where it is understood that some people, what are questionable methods, and if you're too scared to rat on your supervisor, here's a person that will help you. That's really important, and that's not very common.
Yes, just reflecting on your last slide, if funding is to be long-term and flexible, it's probably inevitable that you at the end not get exactly what you initially evaluated. So do you think the natural consequence of that is that you should be judging people rather than projects in grant evaluation? And if so, how do you reconcile that with the idea that the public has to join in, which we saw in the previous talk? I mean, maybe if you want public engagement in evaluating grants, they probably are able to evaluate ideas, but not actual people. So
Well, I think that's an interesting challenge. And of course, many granting organizations face that. And the Wellcome Trust, for instance, has decided to put much more weight on the previous success of the PI. So basically, it's more like an award than a grant. And I think that depends very much on the field. And, you know, if you are proposing in engineering to create a product, then you'll have to create that product. You can't just say halfway, okay, I was going to build an electric flying implement, but I'll go back to internal combustion. You can't do that. But in basic research, you can't say what you're going to discover in 5 years. You can say what tools you're going to build, and, you know, what if your competitor actually discovers what you had hoped to discover? So I think basic research grants have to be much more open. And of course, you have to take into account the previous successes of the researcher and the researcher's ability to discover new things. There is much more of an element of trust in the researcher in that than it is for a grant where you have deliverables that you can actually measure. These grants are not the outcomes are not necessarily measurable. And granting organizations are aware of that and usually have both kinds.
I have two hopefully quick questions, I think. Most of the administrators in a lot of universities in Australia are actually researchers as well. Why do the administrators forget that they're researchers and so have this background in training and research integrity? Why do they forget that when they put their administrator hat on? And secondly, you talked about inappropriate incentives for institutions. What would be an appropriate one to stimulate research integrity for institutions? But it's related to those administrators who themselves are often researchers.
Yes, that's a very good question, and I ask myself the same question. I don't know. I don't know why they forget. They should have so much sympathy. I don't know. But it must be somehow seductive. I actually have felt it important to maintain my own lab, to keep my brain grounded. Maybe it is, I don't know. It's a very good question. But that needs psychology or social sciences to figure that out. I'm the wrong person. Incentives for the institutions, also a very interesting question. I notice, and I notice this more in Germany, where I work and live, that prizes for institutions, for instance, I think the government gives prizes for institutions that have a very good sort of minority promotion program, and females are minority, and they get a prize. So people want to win that prize. Maybe prizes for best research integrity structure, for best whistleblowing structure, for best support. Maybe prizes would work. Visibility, that again, tickle the competitiveness of institutions for that kind of thing. If as soon as they come with extra money, there's an interest for the institutions to do that. I just made this up. I don't know whether that's the best incentive, but maybe we can come up with better ideas.
Thank you, Dr. Leptin.
Thank you.